All right, this is where we ended yesterday, or last class. Moving quickly through this. Section 4, Papal Infallibility and the Marian Apparitions. And we know about Mary's apparitions, times she's appeared to people. We've heard and we hear it at school, apparition of Our Lady of Lourdes to St. Bernadette. You may know of Our Lady of Guadalupe to San Juan Diego. So Mary has started to appear more and more in this century, and the century that is rejecting the church, rejecting faith, rejecting all these things that really built society. This is when Mary starts to appear to people, and it makes Pius IX really think about some things. So who are we going to talk about first? St. Catherine Labouré and the miraculous medal. Catherine Labouré was a member of the Daughters of Charity, which was founded by St. Vincent de Paul. Our Lady appeared to Catherine 3 times. She asked Catherine to have a special medal made that resembled the apparition that she saw. She promised that all those who wore the medal would receive special protection and graces from her, from Our Lady. The medal depicts Mary as the Immaculate Conception. Now, that term, Immaculate Conception, is very specific, and at this time, it was a new term, basically. Like, remember before the Council of Nicaea, Trinity was not a word that was widely known, but after that moment, it was the way we describe something that we already all believed. So that's where we're going to start with St. Catherine Labouré. She had this vision of Mary. Mary says, have this medal made, and anybody who wears it will receive special protection from Our Lady, and that Mary is the Immaculate Conception. We're moving on to Alphonse Ratisbonne. Who is this guy? He's a Jewish man. He's very anti-Catholic. His brother was a Jesuit priest, believe it or not, and his family rejected him because he was Jewish, converts to Catholicism, becomes a priest, family is anti-Catholic, goodbye, you're out. Alphonse was challenged by a family friend to wear the miraculous medal and to pray the Memorare prayer. The Memorare prayer is the prayer that we pray, many of us pray at Sodality, to start off, O Mary, and if after doing that, see if he still hates the church. So Alphonse wanted to show this family friend that this was a silly thing. So he decides to go along with it. He says this prayer every day, wears the medal. A few days later, he was in a church. Why was he in a church? He was actually attending a funeral. So he was at a church. And while wearing the medal, he had a vision of Our Lady and was overwhelmed by God's grace. He couldn't believe it. He didn't expect it, didn't anticipate it, and it was Our Lady who appeared to St. Catherine Labouré, who asked for the medal to be made. So what does Alphonse do? He becomes Catholic, becomes a priest, founded a religious order dedicated to help spread the gospel to the Jewish people, which he was one of, and he wants to bring them the gospel and bring them into the love of Jesus Christ, so that way they can experience what he experienced. So what was the reaction? St. Pius IX hears about this and says that Mary is appearing to the human race to remind the world that they need God. Many political regimes sought to eliminate God to build a perfect society. Pius argued that no, it's the life of grace and the life of God, the life in faith, the life of support of neighbor and love of God is what makes society happen. Elsewhere, in France, we introduce a young girl named Bernadette. She's from Lourdes in the south of France. Her family was extremely poor. Her father lost his job, and the family was forced to live in an abandoned prison called the Cachot. Bernadette's asthma suffered from this. The prison was abandoned because it was too dangerous to house people in. People were getting sick. It was run down, but it was the only place that they could seek shelter and seek refuge during this very difficult time for the family. One day, Bernadette and her sister's friend went to gather firewood, and not even firewood to keep the house warm. They were so poor that they would go get firewood to sell in town to get money for food. That's how poor this family was. While they were searching for firewood, they came to a grotto at a river crossing. The girls crossed except for Bernadette. Bernadette had to stay behind. It was February and the river was too cold for her to cross. She was worried she would get sick if she got too cold. And while she was waiting in this grotto, which is just like a little cave, It was actually the town dump because it was downriver, so the town would dump everything in this cave, and the river would kind of sweep it away. Bernadette felt a strong wind, and she saw a lady appear in this little niche up in the rock. And the lady prayed with Bernadette. When her sister and her sister's friend returned, she told them what happened, swore them to secrecy. But if you haven't already found out, secrets don't really exist, especially among young people. This girls did not keep the secret, and everyone in the town found out about Bernadette, and they made fun of her by the whole town. She was told not to go back to the grotto by her parents, by the civil authorities. The civil authorities at the time were trying to impress the French government with how sophisticated their town is, and in hopes that they would get a train line down to their town, and they couldn't be respectable if they had this religious event happening in there. But St. Bernadette told Our Lady that she would, so she did. When Bernadette was with the lady, she was in a spiritual ecstasy. Nothing could distract her. Nothing could pull her away from looking at what she and only she could see. Local authorities asked for proof that the lady was real. They were upset with the religious uprising. They believed that they would make their town look foolish. And proof came February 25th, 1858. The lady appeared in Bernadette and said to her, "Drink from the spring." At first, Bernadette went to go drink from the river because she was right next to the river, because she didn't see a spring. The lady corrected Bernadette and said, "No, don't drink from the river. Drink from the spring." She didn't know where it was, so she starts to dig for a spring and drink from whatever she could find. So she's digging around in the dirt, in the cave, in the grotto, and as she's digging, she gets to some water, but the water mixes with the dirt. She was just digging, so it's kind of like mud at this point, and she wants to do what the lady says, so she starts to try to drink, and everybody looking at her thinks she's insane because they don't see what's in the rock. They just see this young girl digging in the mud and trying to drink it. So they took her away in disgrace. Her family was ashamed and embarrassed, even more so, on top of their poverty situation. But when they took her off, as soon as they pulled her away and the crowds dissipated, a spring bubbled up in the place where she was digging. Many were cured by drinking and bathing in these waters, cured of many diseases, physical. People who were blind could see. People who had deformities, their body was healed. When asked what the lady's name was, Bernadette didn't know, so she waited for another apparition and asked her name, and finally the lady answered, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Let me go back on Bernadette a little bit. She's poor, she's uneducated, she was actually held back in school so much that she was the oldest student in her grade and had not made her first Holy Communion yet. That's how much she struggled with school. This is important because she did not know what "I am the Immaculate Conception" meant. She had no clue what that meant. Bernadette wouldn't know what this means. Pope Pius IX only gave this teaching 4 years earlier, and this is the proof that the priests believed. They knew Bernadette couldn't know this. They knew that she couldn't even memorize prayers like the Our Father and necessary prayers, but she can come up with "I am the Immaculate Conception." That's impossible. So they believed in what had happened. She entered a community of religious where she remained for the rest of her life. She took care of the sick and the elderly sisters. She herself suffered from a bone cancer, but never told anybody, never complained. At 35, she passed away, and her body is incorrupted, is in Navarre, France today. And there's so much more about St. Bernadette that I wish we could talk about, but we are at the end of the trimester, and I want to make sure we've covered everything beforehand. If you have any questions about the trip Kellenberg takes, find me at any time. Find Mrs. Harnish at any time. I think people know that we go every summer to serve in Lourdes. It's an amazing place. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it if they have any questions. So back to St. Pius IX again. What was his legacy about? What did he give us? Well, he popularized a few devotions. Devotions are things that people do that they're prayerful things that are kind of routine. Some people have a devotion of the rosary where they pray the rosary regularly. Some people pray midday prayer at Kellenberg. Some people pray the Angelus on their own. So what were some of the ones that he offered to the church? This devotion of the precious blood of Jesus, that Jesus' blood saves us from sin. His blood is in the Eucharist. The Eucharist is part of every Catholic. So Jesus' blood flows through every Catholic's heart and creates one Catholic family. He gives us this image that kind of unites the church in this very troubled time. He names St. Joseph the patron of the Universal Church and makes March 19th a solemnity of St. Joseph. We had that Mass last week with Father Dan that we put up on the website. After his death, his body was transferred to a church called St. Lawrence outside the walls. He wasn't buried in the typical place where popes were buried. He was buried in just a general Catholic church in the area because he was a simple man and wanted to be laid to rest as a simple man would. This procession was attacked by anti-Catholic Freemasons, so we see that there is still this tumultuous time in Italy during these times of these popes. Next pope we'll talk about is Leo the 13th. He was the first pope to be filmed on video, so we have video of him, which is kind of, I always like to bring those things up because it kind of tells us where we are in modern times. Unlike in Pius IX's church, which had been in battle mode against heresies of the time, Pope Leo the 13th chose to dialogue with the church and the forms of new government. He realized we've moved past the time period where people are willing to negotiate. We got to move past that. We got to get along with these new governments, these new regimes. So he fought for the rights of God and the church in the world. He wanted to reconnect governments that had stopped diplomatic relations with the church. He had experience in being a papal diplomat in the past. European governments had become more accepting of Catholic citizens. The church isn't the enemy anymore as it once was. So let's try to work out some ways that we can coexist. Pope Leo the 13th restores the study of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was, we consider him one of the greatest theologians of all time, but for centuries, people didn't read him. He's just kind of forgotten about. And Leo the 13th kind of re-establishes that traditional use of what St. Thomas Aquinas gives us in the church. He writes many encyclicals. We know an encyclical is a letter of a pope. One encyclical encourages Catholics to study Aquinas. He writes another encyclical that encourages Catholics to read the Bible. He wrote 11 encyclicals on the Rosary, and for that, he has the affectionate title, the Rosary Pope. His big encyclical that he's mostly known for is this encyclical Rerum Novarum, which is the church's first social encyclical. So we've talked about how the church can talk about faith and morals. And this kind of breaks that tradition. The church is not talking about faith and morals per se. The church is but bad choice of words. The church is addressing society, things that are going on in society that we can't sit by and let happen. We are living now through the Industrial Revolution. Some have called this social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. If you can make money, make as much as you can. And if you don't have money, do everything you can to survive. This is not how people should be treating each other. And the church looks at this and says, this extreme capitalism is creating problems. We have children who are working. We have families who have barely anything to make it in this world. Meanwhile, the richest of the rich live lives of extreme luxury. And this is wrong. There's injustice in the world that we have to address. And government's not going to address it because they're not affected by it. The wealthy aren't going to address it because it would hurt them. And the poor can't address it because they don't have the means. They can't sacrifice work time to go protest. There's very, very dire situations in these industrial countries that are revolutionizing so quickly. People are earning starvation wages, which Leo speaks out against, which is paying a worker barely enough to survive, where every day they work, they get the money they need to eat that day, and then they have to go back to work the next day because they have no more money. This happens today all over the world. In many poor countries, people have to choose between work and medicine, or food and medicine. They have to choose if they're going to go home or they're going to sleep at the factory, so that way they can not miss that much time making whatever they're making, so that way they can earn what they need to live. They have what they need, but they can't lose a day. They can't get sick. They can't take a day off. And this was what was happening during the Industrial Revolution. So we issued this social encyclical to speak out against this injustice that we see all around us in the world. At the same time, Karl Marx, one of the big founders of communism, saw what was happening with the Industrial Revolution and had a different idea of how things should be. He writes the Communist Manifesto and believes that workers needed to rise up violently against the rich. Violent revolution is necessary to usher a perfect world for workers. Saw religion as the opiate of the masses. So he wants better situations for workers as well, but he doesn't believe that it comes through religion. It doesn't come through faith. He believes it comes through violence and by overthrowing the powers that be in order for the poor to rise up. That's a very simplified way of putting it, but two sides of the argument, two sides of the issue of this industrial revolution, this social Darwinism, this extreme capitalism. The church says we need to treat people better and we need to make sure that people have rights. And Karl Marx says rise up violently, overthrow the oppressors. I think you know which side the church would stand on in that. And we'll end it here today, and we'll start with tomorrow on Rerum Novarum a little bit more. Thank you guys very much. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and like and subscribe. No, just kidding. I'll talk to you guys next class. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.